I have worked the processing floor at Keth Spur for 11 years. And in that time, I have seen things that do not appear anywhere in the station's official incident logs. I am the one who writes those logs. I make that choice deliberately. The morning Sarah Vant came through Bay 14 with her cargo, I was standing at my intake desk running recertification forms on a bulk grain hauler out of the Keth corridor. It was a slow shift. It was always a slow shift in the third week of a transit window. The big commercial tonnage had already cleared. The colony resupply runs had already cleared, and what was left was the long tail. Independent contractors, heritage traders, a few livestock and specialty cargo handlers who moved things the major carriers wouldn't touch for insurance reasons. I liked the long tail weeks. The paperwork was odd, and the people were quiet, and nobody from Central Compliance had any interest in what we were doing. That morning, Central Compliance had sent Vetheran. He arrived on the inbound shuttle from Reza Station 2 hours before Sarah's crate came off the J14 docking arm, and he announced himself at my desk with his rating badge already extended. Gold tier compliance at Keth Spur meant approximately nothing, because Keth Spur was a waystation, not a port of entry, and his jurisdictional authority over our manifest reviews was narrow to the point of theoretical. He knew that. I knew that. He had the kind of face that had spent a long time pretending not to know things, which is a different kind of face from the kind that genuinely doesn't know them. Rail DOS, he said, reading my desk plate. Station steward, 2nd grade. That's correct. He said, a data scroll on my desk. I'll be conducting a sampling review of specialty and exotic cargo manifests, processed through this bay in the last 60-day window. I'll need workstation access and the transit logs going back to the window opening. I gave him what he was entitled to. He sat at the secondary terminal to my right, and he began working through the manifests with the methodical patience of someone who does this for a living and does not enjoy it, but has found a way to make it useful regardless. I went back to my grain hauler, recert. Neither of us spoke for about 40 minutes. The thing about Iran, I am trying to be fair, was that he was good at his job in the narrow sense of knowing every procedural lever and the exact pressure to apply to each one. He had processed through Keth Spur twice in the previous 18 months, according to the visitor logs I checked later, and both times he had departed with significant resolution fees collected from contractors who had minor filing irregularities in their manifests. Minor irregularities. The kind that exist because the people filing the manifests are animal handlers, frontier traders, not compliance lawyers, and the filing system was written by compliance lawyers who have never had their hands in a Tier 3 livestock pen at 3 in the morning. The fees were technically valid. That is the precise degree to which they were valid. I had heard about his 2 previous visits, but had not been on shift for either of them. The steward who had handled the second visit had described him as meticulous. She used the word in the tone that means something else. Then the docking arm signaled an arrival on J14, and the floor started moving again. The handling crew brought the crate through on a standard transit dolly. One of the sealed composite units, gray-paneled, for live cargo with the orange diagonal bands and the biometric locks. It was large, larger than most of what came through Bay 14. The handling crew, 3 of them, were moving with the careful deliberateness of people who are professionally accustomed to large live cargo units, who have, nonetheless, developed a personal opinion about this particular one. I noticed 2 of them had positioned themselves at the rear corners rather than beside the ventilation grills. That is a handling preference that develops after a crate has made a sound you remember. Behind the crate came Sarah Vant. I did not know her name yet. What I saw was a woman in a standard contractor's work jacket, gray-brown, the kind with the reinforced cuffs and the breast pocket that holds your transit credentials, so you don't have to dig for them at the clearance desk. She was medium height, medium build, hair pulled back in a plain knot, no accessories I could see, boots that had been resoled at least once. She had one hand resting lightly on the side of the crate as she walked, not steadying it, not guiding it, just resting there. The way you might walk with your hand on a fence rail, on a path you know well. She came to my desk and produced her transit credentials before I asked. That alone put her in the top 15 of contractors I process. Sarah Vant, she said. Independent transit contractor, license Bravo 74. Single cargo unit live, classification Tier 4 restricted. CP7 on the manifest, Keth species, female adult. Destination is Voreth Outpost, Spur 12. I have the receiving authorization and the Voreth biosafety clearance in packet 2 of my credentials. She handed me the credential scroll. I opened it. Everything was there, organized in the correct order, which almost never happens. The Voreth biosafety clearance was current. The cargo classification was correctly filed. Tier 4 restricted, which for a Keth was accurate, and I noted, significantly understated in the way that all official classifications of Keth were understated. Because the people who write the classifications have generally not spent time near Keth. I had seen a Keth once before through security glass at the transit hub on Waystation 12 years ago. That had been a young one, sub-adult, according to the handler, which meant it was roughly the size of a large earth lion, and it had been pacing, attainment pen, with a quality of attention that made the security glass feel less reassuring than it looked. This crate was significantly larger than that containment pen. I was processing Vance's credentials, and not thinking about that when Aaron appeared at my shoulder. Tier 4 restricted, he said. He was looking at my terminal, not at her. That's correct, she said. Single handler? That's correct. He picked up his own data scroll and began comparing something on it against her filed paperwork. I knew what he was doing. He was looking for a discrepancy. Any discrepancy, something small enough to be arguable, but large enough to justify a hold. It is a technique that works well against contractors who are tired or underprepared, or who have the kind of quiet desperation that makes them willing to pay a resolution fee to keep their schedule intact. I had watched him use it 3 times already that morning on the long-tail manifests. 2 of them had paid. Sarah Vant watched him work through her paperwork and said nothing. Your cargo origin documentation, Aran said. It lists the capture location as Sector 7, Voreth Outer Reach. But your transport origination point is Waystation, which is Sector 4. I need a chain of custody filing for the transit between those 2 locations. Vant reached into her jacket's inner pocket and produced a second credential scroll without hesitation. That would be Document 7 in Packet 3. Chain of custody, Voreth Outer Reach to Waystation Transit Hold, signed by both Waystation Biosafety and the Voreth Wildlife Authority. Dates and handler certifications are on the back. Aaron took it. He read it. He set it down. Your handler certification is graded for Keth sub-adult, he said, not adult. Handler certification scales to the individual animal's behavioral assessment, not to a general species classification, she said. CP7's behavioral assessment is on file with the Voreth Wildlife Authority and was re-evaluated 14 months ago. That assessment grades her as equivalent to a well-socialized sub-adult for handling purposes. The documentation is in Packet 4. Took Packet 4. He read it. There was a pause that lasted about 4 seconds longer than a pause that contains a genuine administrative question. I have worked this desk long enough to know the difference between a pause that means someone is checking a thing and a pause that means someone is deciding whether to keep pushing anyway. He kept pushing anyway. I'm placing provisional hold on the cargo unit pending a physical inspection of the animal. Against the behavioral assessment documentation, he said. This is a standard Tier 4 verification procedure. That's within your authority, she said. I'll need to be present. Shh. Handler presence during Tier 4 inspections is optional at the reviewing officer's discretion. CP says behavioral assessment notes that she responds adversely to unfamiliar handlers in enclosed spaces without her primary contact present. Vance said, I'd recommend you consider that before exercising discretion. The documentation is in Packet 5. He did not take Packet 5. He was not interested in Packet 5. What he was interested in was the fact that a Tier 4 inspection generates a holding fee, a handling surcharge, and a re-clearance processing charge, and that all 3 of those would fall to Vance's contractor account and would need to be settled before she could proceed. This was the mechanism. The documentation was not the point. The documentation was the reason you were allowed to have the mechanism. Bay holding. Unit C, he said to the handling crew. I'll conduct the inspection in 30 minutes. The handling crew moved the crate toward bay holding. I watched Vant watch the crate move. V, and something passed across her face that was not concern and was not anger. It was the expression of a person who has decided to let something proceed, because stopping it now would cost Moss more than letting it reach its natural conclusion. She went with the crate. Aran went back to my secondary terminal and made a note in his review log. I filed the whole documentation and thought about the exact nature of that expression. The patience in it, sees the specific kind of patience that is not resignation and is not tolerance, but is something more like the calm confidence of someone who knows how a hand is going to play before all the cards are on the table. She went with the crate. Fran went back to my secondary terminal and made a note in his review log. I filed the whole documentation, and for the next 30 minutes, tried to return to the grain hauler recert with limited success. The thing that occupied my attention, and I am not a person who is ordinarily occupied by anything other than the task in front of me. I have done this job for 11 years, and I am very good at keeping the space between my ears organized along professional lines, was the crate, specifically. The crate moving down the corridor toward Bay holding on the dolly, with Vance's hand resting on the panel side, and the question of what the crate contained and what was going to happen when someone opened it in an enclosed space without having spent any particular time thinking about what they were opening. I have processed Tier 4 restricted cargo before. There are categories within the tier: cetacean analogs, armored quadrupeds, several species of colonial predator, and each of them has its particular character, specific way of making you aware that the classification is earned. The Tier 4 I think about most, prior to that morning, was a bonded pair of Vorith ridge crawlers that came through on a research transport 14 months ago. 400-kilogram ambush predators, individually, but the pair moved as a unit, and the unit had opinions about enclosed spaces. I had watched the handling crew for that transit communicate in the specific economy of people who have agreed in advance not to make any sudden movements, and I had understood the agreement. The crate from J14 was larger than the paired ridge crawler unit. I went back to my paperwork and worked through it with the slightly elevated attention of someone who is not worried exactly who has noted the dimensions of the situation and has not fully filed those dimensions away. I should explain what a Keth is, because the official classification does not do it. The Vorith Outer Reach is a frontier system on the far edge of the mapped spur corridor, and the Keth are what happened when apex predator evolution had a very long time and very limited competition. They are feline in the way that a thunderstorm is feline. You can see the family resemblance if you look at the right angle, calling it that feels like it's missing the point. Adult females run between 300 and 400 kilograms. The coat is smooth and dark, not black, exactly, more the color of deep water, with articulated shoulder and hip plating that is actually modified, bone structure, not external armor, which means it is part of the animal, and cannot be removed and does not reduce flexibility in any meaningful way. The skull is broad and heavy, disproportionately so even for the body, which is itself disproportionate. The eyes are pale, almost colorless, and they have a quality of steadiness that you notice immediately, and continue to notice at intervals for the rest of the time you are in the same with them. The Keth's range in the Vorith Outer Reach runs to several thousand square kilometers per individual. There are no pack behaviors, no territorial coalitions. They do not need them. They are the top of everything in their habitat, and they have been the top of everything in their habitat for long enough that the behavioral literature describes their temperament as, quote, confident and non-reactive to standard environmental stimuli, which is the scientific way of saying that nothing has ever happened to them that required them to be afraid, and so they are not. And this is more unsettling than aggression would be, because aggression has a logic you can work with. What the official documents call a Keth's behavioral assessment is actually measuring one specific thing: whether the animal has identified a primary contact. If it has, and if the primary contact is present, the behavioral assessment grades low risk. If the primary contact is absent, the assessment grades at exercise extreme caution, which in the field translates to do not enter the space. The official documentation phrases this as an adversarial response to unfamiliar handlers in enclosed spaces. What it means in practice is that a Keth that has a person is unreachable by anyone else. This distinction matters. I know it now. Did not fully know it then. Which is why, when Aaron walked into Bay holding with his data scroll and his two-person security detail and his provisional hold authorization, I was still at my desk thinking about grain hauler paperwork. I heard it from the Bay before I saw it. Not a sound from the Keth, no sound from any animal. What I heard was one of the security detail officers, a woman named Preska, whom I had worked with for 6 years and who I had never heard make a sound like that before, making a very quiet, very controlled noise that was not quite a word, and was not quite a gasp, and was the sound that comes out of a person when their body has registered, something that their professional training is still trying to categorize. I left my desk. By the time I reached the Bay holding entrance, Aran had the crate open. The biometric panel on the front of the unit was cycling through its post-release sequence, which meant Vant had authorized the release, which meant she had complied with the inspection procedure. The crate door was open. The interior was empty. The Keth was in the Bay. It had come out of the crate in whatever direction it chose, happened to be toward the back wall of the holding area, and it had turned, and now it was standing in the middle of the space in the way that large predators stand in spaces. Not tensed, not posed, simply present in a way that makes the available volume feel smaller than its dimensions suggest. It was looking at Aaron. I want to be precise about that look. I have tried to describe it several times in my head since that morning, and I keep reaching for the wrong comparisons. It was not aggressive. It was not territorial. It was not the wide-eyed alertness of an animal in an unfamiliar environment processing data. It was the look of something that had walked into a room, assessed the contents of the room, assigned each element in the room its appropriate category, and was now waiting to see whether the room had anything further to add. Aaron was standing very still. His security detail, Pressa, and a man named Orvith, whose family I knew, were standing near the entrance, is to say near me, which is to say as far from the Keth as the Bay permitted. Neither of them had drawn their weapons, and I noticed them both, making the specific calculation that a person makes when they understand drawing a weapon might produce a worse outcome than drawing it. Serafant was standing 3 meters from the Keth, which was 3 meters closer than anyone else in the room. She was not doing anything. She had her hands loosely at her sides, and her weight settled, and she was watching the Keth with the same quality of calm, attention that the Keth was giving to Aaron. The Keth looked at Aaron for another 2 seconds. Then it turned its head and looked at Vant. What happened next? I want to be precise about this because I have replayed it in my memory many times, and I want to get it right. The Keth moved, not fast, not slow, just with the continuous, unhurried economy of something that has never had reason to be other than what it is. It crossed the space between itself and Vant in 4 strides, and on the 4th stride it dropped its head, and the weight of that head, 380 kilograms of animal, skull alone probably pushing 30, came down against Vant's left knee and settled there. Vant put her hand on top of the Keth's head. The Keth made a sound. I do not have a good word for it. It was low and resonant and came from somewhere behind the animal's ribs, and it was not a purr, and it was not a growl, and it was not either of the warning vocalizations described in the official Keth behavioral documentation. It was something older than any of the categories. It was the sound of an apex predator that has located the exact spot in the world where it intends to remain. The Bay was very quiet. Aran broke the silence first, which was a mistake, because by breaking it, he established that he was the one who needed it to end. The behavioral assessment indicates the animal makes a skull contact display as a primary contact bonding behavior, he said, reading from his scroll. He was using the even administrative tone of a person who has decided that remaining inside the procedure is safer than acknowledging that the procedure has become irrelevant. This is consistent with the documentation. Yes, Vant said. I'll need to complete the physical inspection. You're welcome to, she said. Nobody moved. The security detail did not move toward the Keth. The Keth did not move away from Vant. Aran did not move toward either of them. He stood there with his data scroll and his provisional hold authorization and the full weight of his Tier 4 inspection protocol, and none of it had any purchase on the situation. The Keth was not a compliance issue. It was not amenable to provisional holds. It was sitting in a waystation holding bay, on the far side of its crate door with its skull, against the knee of a woman who had come in on the J14, armed with clean paperwork. And the fact that Aran was technically the most administratively credentialed person in the room had not registered with it at all. Can bring her closer to the inspection point if that's helpful, Vance said. She'll follow me. Aran stopped. That won't be necessary. I can conduct the visual inspection from the current position, which was approximately 5 meters away. He conducted the visual inspection from approximately 5 meters away. He checked boxes on his scroll. The Keth watched him with the patience of something that has decided to observe rather than act, which, I understood later, was itself a decision with significant implications. The Keth was not ignoring him. It was watching him the way a very senior person watches a junior one make a mistake, giving him enough room to make it fully and arrive at the outcome on his own. Visual inspection complete, Aran said. Animal matches behavioral assessment documentation, consistent with Tier 4 restricted classification. Good, Vance said. However, he was back on his scroll. He had found something. Or decided to find something. The receiving authorization from Vorith Outpost includes a notation that the intended use of this animal is research and habitat assessment. The research authorization code listed is from the Vorith Wildlife Authority, Category 3. Category 3 authorizations do not cover transport of an adult Keth for off-habitat relocation without a secondary endorsement from the Spur 12 Transit Authority. I don't see that secondary endorsement in your documentation. Vant looked at him for a moment. The secondary endorsement from the Spur 12 Transit Authority, she said, is document 14, in packet 6. I'll note packet 6 was not included in the standard Tier 4 inspection documentation set, which is why it was separated. It's in my bag. She walked to her bag, which was on the bench by the holding bay entrance. The Keth walked with her. Not at her heel, not beside her in any trained companion sense, simply adjacent, maintaining the distance that it had established as its preferred distance, which was the distance at which the crown of its skull was level with her left hand, without either of them making any particular effort. It moved the way a shadow moves when the light moves. It was not following her. It was just not somewhere else. Piasca made a small lateral movement when the Keth drew within 2 meters of the entrance, and then did not make any further movements at all. The Keth did not look at her. Vant took packet 6 from her bag, extracted document 14, and handed it to Aran. Aran read it. I watched him read it, and I watched his face work through the specific sequence that a face works through when someone has had every card played, against them in turn, and has now reached the bottom of the hand. Document 14 was current, correctly stamped, and bore the endorsement of the Spur 12 Transit Authority's Director of Biosafety, countersigned by the Regional Compliance Liaison. It was, in every administrative sense, impeccable. He spent 30 seconds on it, longer than necessary. This document is from 8 months ago, he said. The validity period for Spur 12 secondary endorsements is 18 months, she said. It's current. I'm aware of the validity period. The bay was quiet again. I watched the Keth, watching Aran. It had resettled against Vance's knee when she stopped moving, and it had not shifted since. Its tail was wrapped loosely around her left ankle in the way that a large animal settles when it has decided the present location is the right one. The pale eyes moved across Aran with the same steady attention they had maintained since the crate opened. There was something in that attention that I found. Standing in the entrance with a half-completed incident report forming in the back of my mind, genuinely difficult to look away from. It was not threat, I want to be clear about that. The Keth was not displaying threat behavior by any standard, I know. It was displaying something that the official behavioral documentation does not have a category for, which is sustained interest in the outcome of a situation that concerns its person. It was paying attention. Carefully, continuously, with the full cognitive weight of an apex predator that has never needed to develop a threshold between observation and action. The bay held like that for perhaps 90 seconds, which is a long time when nobody is talking and the largest thing in the room is watching. Aran had his scroll. He had his provisional hold authorization. He had, from a strictly procedural standpoint, the legitimate authority to request that Vant step back from the animal so that the inspection could be conducted according to standard Tier 4 protocols, which specify a minimum of 3 meters between handler and animal during the reviewing officer's documentation verification. He did not make that request. I understand why. The request would have required Vant to move, which would have required the Keth to respond to that movement. And Aran had just watched the Keth cross a holding bay in 4 strides to maintain preferred distance from Vant's knee. He had watched it settle 380 kilograms against her leg with the calm finality of something that has identified the coordinates of home and intends to occupy them. The request would have been procedurally valid and practically impossible in the same instant, and he was smart enough to know which of those 2 facts was going to matter. So he checked his boxes from 5 meters away. Keth watched him do it, and Vant said nothing, and I stood in the entrance and did not announce my presence because I had not been invited, and my presence was not required, and also because I was, honestly, unable to make myself leave. Aran had 1 move left. I could see him deciding whether to use it. The move was to extend the hold on procedural grounds. There is a general provision in Tier 4 inspection protocol that allows a reviewing officer to flag an animal for psychological evaluation if the officer believes the behavioral assessment documentation may not accurately reflect current behavioral status. It is a catch provision, deliberately vague, and it had been used before to hold animals in transit indefinitely, while the evaluation was scheduled, completed, appealed, and refiled. It was the kind of move that costs a contractor 6 to 10 weeks and enough in fees and schedule disruption to make the underlying transit uneconomical. Under Tier Inspection Protocol, Section 9, Paragraph 4, I'm exercising officer discretion to flag CP7 for psychological behavioral evaluation before transit clearance can be issued, he said. The flag is based on observed behavioral deviation from the filed assessment, specifically, unsolicited movement toward station personnel during an official inspection, which is classified as a Category 2 alert behavior. He was citing Keth moving toward Vant when she crossed to her bag. The animal had moved toward its primary contact. This is explicitly described in the behavioral documentation as a primary bonding display and is listed in the assessment as Category 1 non-threatening behavior. He was reclassifying it as a Category 2 alert. It was not a permissible reading of the documentation. It was also, under the narrow procedural rules of a Tier 4 inspection, his call to make in the short term, pending appeal. Vant's face did not change. She reached back into her bag and produced a second data scroll, different from the credential scroll, thinner, the kind you use for legal and administrative filings. She opened it. I'll file an immediate administrative challenge under Transit Compact Article 17, she said. I'll need to identify the reviewing officer's jurisdictional chain and confirm the station authority contact for the challenge. Registration. Article 17 challenges, Aran said, require a station authority signatory of grade 4 or above. Station steward, 2nd grade, he said the words with the same careful emphasis as before, but slower, is below that threshold. The nearest grade 4 authority is at Riza Station, which was a 17-hour shuttle trip, during which the hold would remain in effect, during which the holding fees, handling surcharges, and provisional flag processing costs would continue to accrue. I want to describe what I felt at that moment, because it is relevant to understanding what happened next. I felt something specific that I do not often feel on this job, which was a kind of quiet anger. Not hot, not reactive, just present, the way the cold is present at the end of a long watch. I had processed Vant's documentation. It was correct. Every packet, every document, every cross-reference. She had done everything that the system asks you to do, and she had done it better than most professionals I process, and the system was being used against her. Not because her paperwork was wrong, but because the person using it had authority he could deploy without justification and a calculation about what it would cost her to fight it. That is what the tier system looks like from this desk, sometimes. Safety. Just wait. I was about to speak. I was not sure what I was going to say. I had not worked out the procedural basis yet. When the Keth moved, not fast, not toward Aaron, it simply stood. All 380 kilograms of it, from its settled position against Vance's knee, came up to its full height in the way that something stands when it has been sitting quietly and has now decided that sitting quietly has served its purpose. There is a difference in a room between something being large and something being its full size. The Keth, in its settled position, had been large. The Keth standing was its full size, and its full size had a different relationship with the available space in Bay Holding Unit C. It was not a larger animal. It was the same animal making the same square footage suddenly feel like a different calculation. It did not bare teeth. It did not vocalize. It stood with its weight evenly distributed, and its pale eyes on Aaron, and the articulated shoulder plating shifting slightly as it drew a long, completely unhurried breath. The breath was the loudest thing in the room. It was still looking at Aaron. I thought, standing in that entrance, about what the conclusion looked like from Aaron's side. He had come to Keth Spur with a gold tier badge and a reliable methodology and a morning, successful resolution fees behind him. He had found a Tier 4 restricted cargo with minor documentation complexity and a single, female, contractor and a holding fee schedule that would create the right gov pressure. He had run the methodology, and it had not worked, and now he was standing in Bay Holding Unit C with a 380-kilogram apex predator at its full height looking at him with the calm, complete attention of something that has arrived at a conclusion. Not dangerous, not yet. Vaught had not yet spoken. The Keth was waiting, in the way that something waits when it has an instruction it will follow until it doesn't. The instruction was Vance's voice. And the instruction was easy, and the instruction had not arrived in response to the flag notice. And the Keth had been waiting through the entire procedural exchange, and now it was standing, and the standing was its own statement about how long it intended to keep waiting. And the specific quality of that look shifted, not to aggression, to something that I can only describe as final assessment. The particular kind that comes at the end of an observation period, when enough data has been gathered to reach a conclusion. It was looking at him the way you look at something you have been watching, and have now finished evaluating. Preska said, very quietly to Orvith, "Don't move." Orvith said nothing. Aaron said nothing. Aunt Vance said, "Easy, CP, we're all right." And the Keth pressed in. Not back. In. Its shoulder moved against Vance's arm with the deliberate weight of 380 kilograms, communicating something that I do not have the right word for. It was not reassurance. It was the other direction. It was the Keth establishing, in the specific physical grammar that large predators use when they have decided something, that it was here, that it had assessed the situation, that it had assessed Vantmont's calm as the correct orientation toward the situation, and had matched it, and was going to continue matching it for as long as she held on. But that the assessment of Aaron had been completed and was not favorable. The room understood this. I watched Aaron understand this, which was a different thing from Aaron accepting it. Training and his professional habit were still running the procedure, still looking for the next lever. Behind those processes, something else was happening, which was that his body had received the information that his professional training had not yet processed, that the Keth's patience was a choice, and that the choice was grounded entirely in Sarah Vance's voice saying easy, and that the voice was going to remain easy for exactly as long as the situation gave it reason to. "Station authority," said a voice from the doorway. I had not heard her arrive. I do not think anyone had. Station Commander Vethmaran, no relation to Aaron, which was a thing that occasionally required clarification, was standing in the bay holding entrance with her hands behind her back and the expression of someone who has been standing somewhere quietly for longer than anyone realized and has now decided to stop being quiet. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of posture that develops in people who have commanded stations for 20 years and have made peace with the fact that posture is the cheapest form of authority and therefore the most reliable. She looked at the room before she stepped into it. I watched her do this, take in Aaron at the far end of the inspection table, Vant at the bench with the Keth settled against her, Preska and Orvath near the entrance, the crate door open, The documentation spread across the inspection table. She took in all of it in the space of about 2 seconds, which is how long it takes someone who has assessed up rooms for 20 years to read the situation. Then she stepped into it. I had worked under her for 7 years. I had never seen her raise her voice. I had also never seen anyone come out ahead of her in a procedural exchange, because she had a habit of arriving at the procedural exchange already holding the conclusion, and working backward to the moment when it became visible to everyone else. She walked to the inspection table and picked up document 14. She examined it for approximately 5 seconds. She set it down. "Officer Aaron," she said, "what is the current validity status of the SPUR 12 secondary endorsement?" "Current," he said. "What is the behavioral assessment classification for unsolicited primary contact movement toward the primary handler?" There was a pause. "Category 1, he said, non-threatening. Your flag cites it as Category 2. In my assessment as the reviewing officer." "Your assessment as reviewing officer is limited, under Tier 4 Protocol Section 9 Paragraph 4, deviations from the filed behavioral assessment. Movement toward primary handler is documented in the assessment as expected contact-seeking behavior. It is not a deviation." She was not looking at him with any particular expression. She was simply stating the thing. "Remove the flag. Issue the standard clearance. I'll countersign." Aran did not move for a moment. Then he looked at the Keth. The Keth was looking at him. It had returned to its position against Vance's knee at some point in the last few minutes. When exactly, I couldn't have said. It moved so naturally into its place beside her that the arrival and the settled state were almost indistinguishable. Its tail was back around her ankle. Its pale eyes were on Aaron with the unchanged, unhurried attention that had not wavered since the crate door opened. Aran updated his scroll. The flag came off. He began typing the standard clearance notation. Moran signed the clearance form and slid it to him. He countersigned from where he was standing, at the far end of the inspection table. The table was not a long table. He was standing as far down it as he could get while still technically being at it, which was a distance of perhaps 2 meters. But the 2 meters felt deliberate. "Transit clearance is issued," Marin said. "Tour window on J14 opens in 4 hours. Steward Doss, please ensure the cargo unit is prepped for resealing when the contractor is ready to proceed." "Understood," I said. I watched Vant begin walking the Keth back toward the crate. It went with her the same way it had gone everywhere else. Not because she directed it, but because wherever she was happened to be where it was, and that had a quality of certainty to it that I found standing there with my incident report, half-formed in the back of my mind. Difficult to articulate and easy to recognize. Aran gathered his documents and left the bay. He did not speak to anyone on the way out. Kreska let out a long, slow breath and looked at Orvath, and then at me, and I shook my head slightly, which was the most commentary I was prepared to make on record. At the crate entrance, Vance stopped. The Keth put its head through the door, then stopped, then turned and looked back at her. "Come on," she said. Not a command. More the way you say, "Come on," to someone who is perfectly capable of making the sensible decision and is simply taking a moment before they make it. The Keth went into the crate. She sealed the panel. The biometric lock cycled. She picked up her bag, her credentials scroll, and the small kit she had set on the bench, and she began walking toward the bay exit. She stopped once at my position. "Thank you," she said. "Processing." "Your documentation was in good order," I said. She nodded once. The nod of someone who keeps things in good order and knows why it matters, and walked out. I want to say something about what I observed in those 4 hours while the Keth's crate was repositioned on J14, and Vant completed her pre-departure checks. I walked the bay twice during that window, not because it was required, but because I had the impulse to look at the crate again, at the sealed gray composite panel with its orange diagonal bands and its biometric lock. To confirm that it was still there, I suppose, that the thing inside it was still the thing I had seen. Through the ventilation grill, I could hear the Keth. The same sound it had made in the bay, low and resonant, from behind the ribs. Continuous, not distress, not agitation. The sound of something that was in a box that contained its person, and that had therefore determined that the box was where it should be. The second time I walked through, I stopped by the grill and listened for a full minute. I am not sure what I was waiting for. Some interruption in the sound, perhaps. Some indication that the Keth, settled in its crate in the hour before departure, was something other than entirely at ease. There was none. The sound was steady, completely steady. The low resonance of an apex predator in its chosen place, at rest, waiting without urgency for the next thing. I thought about the moment in the bay when it had stood up. When it had risen from its settled position and simply been its full height in the room, and what that had done to the texture of the air in that enclosed space. It had not acted. That is what I keep coming back to. It had stood, and the standing had been entirely sufficient. The standing was the statement, and Iran had received it. I have worked around bonded animals my whole career, and the thing about bonded animals is that the bond moves in one direction. The human acquires the animal acquires the human. Each holds the other. This is the standard model, and it is correct as far as it goes. The bond is managed. The bond is trained and conditioned and maintained through specific protocols. Protocols are in the behavioral documentation, and the documentation is in the packet, and the packet is filed with the appropriate authority before transit begins. The standard model makes the bond legible to a system like mine. It makes the bond into something with a classification and a tier and a handling surcharge and a behavioral assessment that can be read by a reviewing officer from 5 meters away. What the standard model does not account for is the possibility that the bond is not being managed, that it was not conditioned or trained or maintained through specific protocols, that it began somewhere out in the Vorith outer reach grassland, between a woman with a contractor's work jacket and a Keth that had never in its evolutionary history encountered anything it needed to defer to, and that whatever happened between them in that grassland was not a protocol. That is what I am trying to get at. The bond in the behavioral documentation is described as a primary contact relationship, established through handler familiarization over a period of not less than 90 days. This is accurate, presumably, in the technical sense, but what I saw in Bay Holding Unit C was not the outcome of 90 days of handler familiarization. It was the outcome of 90 days of two things having arrived at a mutual conclusion, each in its own way, each through its own assessment, and the conclusion having had 90 days to become completely settled. The conclusion was, this is my person, this is the one. In the relevant category, we are the same. The Keth did not need 90 days to reach that conclusion. The Keth needed whatever amount of time it takes a Keth to assess another entity's fundamental nature, to look at it, unhurried, with its full cognitive capacity, and determine where it sits in the relevant hierarchy. The 90 days were the time it took for the conclusion to stop being a conclusion and start being a fact. Sarah Vaught was a fact. I have worked around bonded animals my whole career, and I have never before watched a bond make a compliance reviewer stand at the far end of his own inspection table. That is a new data point. I am still organizing it. It looked like, and I am aware this is the kind of language that does not belong in an incident report, which is why it is not in mine. It looked like recognition, the specific mutual bilateral kind. The kind where both parties have independently arrived at the same conclusion about each other, and the conclusion is the same word. Apex. Not tamed, not trained, not managed or assessed or classified at Tier 4 restricted for transport and handling purposes. Just recognized. Keth sat in that bay, with its skull against her knee, and its tail around her ankle, and it watched Aaron run through every formal mechanism available to him in his role as a gold-tier compliance reviewer. And it made a decision, not an animal decision, not a stimulus-response decision, considered decision, arrived at through observation, about whether the situation required it to act, decided the situation did not require it to act. It decided this because Sarah Vaught had said easy, CP, and because the formal mechanisms were going to resolve correctly without it, and because she was there, and that was enough. I think about what that means, what it takes to be the person that a Keth looks at and decides is enough. Not enough to calm it, enough to calibrate it. Enough to make 380 kilograms of apex predator in an unfamiliar enclosed space arrive at the position that the correct response is patience. I think about Iran standing at that inspection table with his gold-tier badge, and his Section 9 authority, and his carefully constructed sequence of procedural levers, and I think about what he must have seen when the Keth stood up. He saw an animal, a large, dangerous, classified Tier 4 animal that was in a space he controlled and was observing him without warmth. What he did not see, what he could not have seen, because his training and his professional framework did not have the category for it, was that the Keth's patience was not constraint. It was not the patience of a contained thing that is prevented from acting. It was the patience of something that has assessed the situation fully and arrived at the conclusion that acting is not yet the right choice. Yet, that word. The Keth's patience contained that word the way a sealed crate contains its cargo, visibly bounded, biometrically locked, entirely secure, up to the moment that the authorized person touches the release. The authorized person was Vance's voice. Easy CP, we're all right. The Keth had heard the distinctions. Moran signed the clearance form and moved on to the rest of her morning. I went back to my desk. Rand filed his review summary before his shuttle departure at 1400. I read it later. It described a standard, Tier 4 inspection at Keth Spur Bay 14. Documentation reviewed, behavioral assessment confirmed, standard clearance issued. No escalations, no flags. Compliant transit contractor, nothing of note. I filed my incident report for the morning's activity at the same time. Transit processing, Bay 14, J14 arm, standard long-tail window. Single Tier 4 restricted cargo unit. Behavioral assessment confirmed. Transit clearance issued and countersigned by station commander. No incidents. That is accurate. There were no incidents. The review officer did his job, and the station commander did hers, and the contractor did hers, and the Keth did something that I do not have an official category for, but that I have been thinking about in the weeks since. When the processing floor is quiet, and the long-tail window is running, and I find myself looking at the bay holding entrance and remembering the sound it made when it settled. They departed on J14 at 1640, 2 hours ahead of the original schedule, because Marin had the window moved as a courtesy, which she is entitled to do for Tier 4 transits, and which she exercised without explanation. I was at my desk when the J14 arm released the docking clamp. The processing floor was quiet. It was the end of the long-tail window, and the handful of other contractors still waiting were in their burrow or their hauler cabs, not on the floor. I had the space to myself. I sat there for a few minutes after the docking arm signal cleared, and I did not do paperwork. I thought about what I had seen. I thought about the difference between an animal being managed and an animal making choices. I thought about the thing the Keth behavioral assessment actually measures. Not dangerousness in the abstract, the specific question of who has been recognized, and how completely, and what that recognition authorizes. I thought about Iran's face at the far end of that table. I did not feel satisfaction about that exactly. I want to be honest. What I felt was something quieter. The recognition of a process having completed correctly, despite the effort put into making it complete, incorrectly, which is not a triumph so much as a return to the way things should have been already. The mechanism had failed, not because someone with more authority intervened, though Moran's presence was decisive. Not because the documentation was overwhelming, though it was. It had failed because the situation contained an element that the mechanism was not designed to accommodate. A 380-kilogram apex predator that had formed an independent assessment of everyone in the room and had the cognitive capacity to act on that assessment without instruction. Aaron's leverage was over Vaught. The fees, the delays, procedural flags. All of it was weight, applied through the assumption that a contractor with a scheduled transit and accruing holding costs eventually make the calculation nice, that paying was cheaper than fighting. It is a reasonable assumption for most contractors. It was an accurate assumption for the two contractors who had paid him that morning. It was not an accurate assumption for Sarah Vaught, but he did not know that yet when he started. By the time he knew it, he was in a holding bay with the Keth standing up, and the Keth's leverage was not over Vaught. That is the thing. The Keth did not have leverage over Vaught at all. What it had was recognition, bilateral assessment, arrived at independently by two apex-calibrated entities. One of them a woman with clean paperwork and boots that had been resoled at least once, The other one 380 kilograms of outer reach evolutionary conclusion. That they were, in the relevant category, the same thing. That is the system the Keth runs on. Not hierarchy, not command, recognition, and it cannot be spoofed. You cannot present documentation to a Keth. You cannot file a procedural flag on its assessment. It watches, it evaluates, it reaches a conclusion, and the conclusion is final. And the conclusion about Sarah Vant was that she was the fixed point around which the correct disposition of everything else in the room should be organized, including Aaron's continued presence at the far end of a 2-meter table. Vant sent a transit completion confirmation from Spur 12, 6 days later, which is the standard documentation for a Tier 4 cargo completion. It was correct in every particular. The Vorith Wildlife Authority acknowledgement was attached. The Spur 12 receiving log showed CP7, adult female Keth, transferred successfully to Vorith Outpost Research Station, behavioral status, stable, primary contact present. I filed it, and went back to my grain hauler paperwork. Iran's sampling reviews were reassigned to a different sector sometime in the following month. I noticed this when I cross-referenced the compliance scheduling for the next transit window. The reassignment notice cited standard rotation protocol. I made no note of it. 3 weeks after the departure I received, through the standard mail routing, a document that was not a transit confirmation and was not official correspondence and was not any category of thing I normally receive in my professional capacity. It was a small printed card, the kind you can have made at any station kiosk, with a picture on the front. The picture was Sarah Vant, standing in what I recognized from the habitat imagery in the Vorith wildlife documentation, the outer reach grassland, long pale grass, low hills, wide sky. She was standing and the Keth was beside her, sitting, its skull plate at the level of her shoulder. It was not pressing against her in the way it had in the bay. It was simply there, in the way that something is simply there when the distance between it and its person is not a managed distance, but a natural one. The distance that exists because both of them are in the same place, and neither of them is anywhere else. On the back of the card, in plain handwriting, processing was in good order. Thank you, Raildos, nothing else. I put it in my desk drawer. It is still there. I do not know why I am keeping it, except that sometimes, when the floor is slow and the long-tail window is running, and a sealed gray composite crate comes through on a dolly with orange diagonal bands, I take it out and look at it for a moment. The Keth is very large in that photograph. I had understood intellectually, in the bay, how large it was. I had the measurements from the behavioral assessment documentation. I had seen it in the space. But in the photograph, Vant standing beside it, and the flat grasslands behind them, and the wide sky, the scale is clarified differently. It is enormous. It is enormously, quietly, enormous in the way of things that have never needed to make a display of their size because their size has never been the relevant question. The relevant question is the photograph and in the bay, and in all the weeks since I have been turning that morning over in my mind is a different one. The relevant question is recognition. Which entities in any given room have been assessed and found to be the thing that everything else orients around? Which ones the calculation runs through? Which ones, when they say easy, the room settles? Sarah Vant was not the most credentialed person in that bay. She was not the highest ranked. She did not have a gold tier compliance badge, or station commander authority, or a security detail. She had a work jacket with reinforced cuffs and boots that had been re-soled at least once, and 6 packets of documentation organized in the correct order. And the Keth had looked at all of that, had looked past all of it, or through it, possibly at something underneath it that none of the rest of us in that bay had instruments to measure. Had looked and recognized and settled its skull against her knee. That is what I am keeping the card for. The photograph of the recognized thing, at rest, in its place. I make that choice deliberately.